The call came on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1983, and the man on the other end of the line wasn't a promoter or a label executive or a journalist or any of the category of people whose calls Michael Jackson had learned to process from behind a specific kind of distance. He was a veterinarian named Dr. James Howell, and what he said was simple: the animal was going to be euthanized by Friday if nobody claimed it. The research facility in Texas was closing one of its programs. The chimpanzee was 2 years old, healthy, no longer useful to the study. Michael listened to the whole thing, standing in the kitchen of his ENCINO home, at 7 in the morning, still in the clothes he'd slept in, because he'd been in the studio until 4 and hadn't made it upstairs. He asked 2 questions. The first was about the animal's condition. The second was about the cost. He said he'd send someone that afternoon. He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then he went upstairs. And when he came back down 2 hours later, he had made a decision that everyone around him would spend the next several weeks trying to talk him out of. The question that never got asked, the one that would have opened everything up if anyone had thought to ask it, was not whether Michael Jackson should have a chimpanzee. That question got asked, constantly, loudly, by managers and publicists and family members who had opinions about optics and professionalism and what the press would do with it. The question that never got asked was why, specifically, a chimpanzee, not a dog, not a cat, not any of the animals that famous people kept in ways that generated warm press coverage and no logistical complications. A chimpanzee, a 2-year-old animal from a research facility that nobody wanted. That question, if anyone had asked it, would have led somewhere much harder to argue with. Hold it in mind. We'll get there. The week before the call from Dr. Howell, Michael had done 4 interviews in 3 days. Thriller had been released in December 1982 and was doing something the music industry hadn't fully processed yet. It wasn't just selling, it was accelerating, crossing from popular into phenomenon. He answered questions about Quincy, about the videos, about the moonwalk he'd performed on Motown 25 2 weeks earlier. He answered the way he'd learned to carefully, with warmth, with the practiced accessibility of someone who has been performing since the age of 5. What he said was true. None of it was false, but there is a difference between true and complete. And by the spring of 1983, Michael Jackson had become someone for whom the complete version of almost everything was kept somewhere the interviews couldn't reach. Consider what his daily life actually looked like at 24 years old. The album had sold 10 million copies and was still climbing. Every conversation, every meeting, every interaction carried the weight of enormous commercial stakes and the expectations of everyone attached to them. The label, the management, the family, the fans who had already begun projecting onto him something larger than any individual human being could comfortably carry. He was surrounded by people, constantly, and every one of those people wanted something from him, or wanted something for him, and the distinction between those 2 things had gotten increasingly hard to locate. That's the room Michael Jackson was living in, when the call came from Texas on a Tuesday morning. Now you know what question you should have been asking. Not whether a chimpanzee made sense, but what was missing from the room so completely that a chimpanzee was the answer. The animal arrived on a Thursday evening in a transport crate that took 2 people to carry. One day before the Friday deadline, Michael had cleared a space in the living room. He'd read everything he could find in 2 days, which was not nothing. Michael's capacity to absorb information on subjects that interested him was one of the things people who worked closely with him consistently mentioned, the way he could take something apart completely in his mind and understand it from the inside out in a fraction of the time most people needed. He knew about diet, about socialization, about the specific behavioral patterns of young chimpanzees removed from their mothers early. He had questions prepared for the handler who'd driven up from the facility. The handler answered them and left. And then it was just Michael and the crate in the living room. with the latch undone, but the door still closed, and the house quiet in the particular way houses get when everyone else has gone for the night, and Michael sitting cross-legged on the floor, about 3 feet away, not moving, not speaking, just present, waiting without performing the waiting. The door opened after 11 minutes. That specific detail matters. Not because 11 minutes is remarkable, it's actually fast for an animal in an unfamiliar environment, but because of what Michael did during those 11 minutes, which was nothing. He did not try to coax. He did not make sounds. He did not offer food or reach toward the crate or do any of the things that instinct suggests when you want an animal to trust you. He simply stayed, still and available, and entirely without agenda. The chimpanzee came out of the crate and stopped and looked at him. Michael looked back. Neither of them moved for almost a full minute. Then the animal crossed the 3 feet of floor between them and sat down about 8 inches from Michael's knee and looked at the wall. That was it. That was the whole of it. No drama, no performance, just 2 beings in a quiet room, each deciding to stay. Something happened in Michael that night that he wouldn't have had words for and didn't try to find them. What he would say later, in various interviews over the following years, was always a version of the same thing that Bubbles didn't know. That was the phrase he kept returning to. Bubbles didn't know. Didn't know about the album, or the moonwalk, or the cameras, or the expectations, or the money, or the mythology that had begun to grow around Michael Jackson, the phenomenon in ways that had very little to do with Michael Jackson. The person sitting on the floor of his living room at 10:30 at night. All of that was invisible to the animal beside him. What was visible was simply Michael, the weight of his presence in the room, the temperature of his body, the sound of his breathing. You cannot manufacture that. You cannot negotiate it or perform it or arrange it. It either exists or it doesn't. Here is what the people who argued against Bubbles didn't understand, and couldn't have understood, because they were approaching the question from the wrong direction. They looked at Michael Jackson's life from the outside and saw success and fame and all the apparatus that surrounds those things, and they saw the chimpanzee as an eccentricity, an oddity, a liability. What they couldn't see from the outside was what Michael could see from the inside, that he was at 24 years old, one of the most publicly visible human beings on Earth, and that the visibility had costs that the album sales didn't offset, that the room he lived in had become a room where every person in it was oriented toward something, toward the brand, toward the business, toward the image, toward their own interests, intersecting with his, and that he had not been in a room without that quality for so long that he had almost stopped noticing it as an absence. Bubbles was the absence. Restored. Keep that in mind as we move into what happened next, because it explains every decision Michael made in the weeks that followed. The week after the chimpanzee arrived, there was a meeting. Michael had known it was coming. His manager had been trying to schedule it since Tuesday, the day after the transport arrived, and the word got out. The meeting was held in the living room, which was the room where Bubbles now spent most of his time, which was not accidental on Michael's part. Sit with that for a second, because it tells you something about where Michael's head was. He didn't move the animal before the meeting. He held the meeting around the animal. The message was not delivered verbally. It was delivered spatially. His manager made the case professionally, and without apparent frustration, which was itself a kind of professionalism. The optics were complicated. The press would turn this into something. There were liability questions, insurance questions, questions about what happened at public events, questions about international travel in the fall. All of it was true. None of it was wrong. The case against keeping the chimpanzee, made on purely practical grounds, was a reasonable case. Michael listened to all of it. Bubbles sat on the couch behind him, methodically taking apart a section of the TV remote that he'd somehow gotten hold of. focused entirely on the engineering problem in front of him. When the manager finished, Michael said, "He doesn't know what thriller is." The manager blinked. Michael clarified, "He doesn't know what any of it is. He just knows I'm here." The meeting ended without resolution, which in this context meant Michael had won, because the only resolution that would have constituted a loss was Michael agreeing to send the animal back, and that didn't happen. The promotional trip to Japan came that fall. Michael brought Bubbles. The chimpanzee attended press conferences, sat beside Michael in hotel rooms, while Michael worked through new material, ate at the same table, slept in the same space. The Japanese press covered it extensively, and the coverage was contrary to what Michael's team had feared, almost uniformly warm. Something about the image, the biggest pop star in the world, and a small chimpanzee, just existing together without ceremony, landed differently than the advisors had predicted. What nobody wrote about was what happened at 2 in the morning in a hotel room in Tokyo. Rooms very different from the one in ENCINO, where a crate door had opened with less than 24 hours before a Friday deadline, when the schedule had finally released Michael for the night, and the handlers were gone, and the phones had stopped. Michael would sit on the floor with his back against the bed, the same position he'd sat in the first night in ENCINO, and Bubbles would arrange himself nearby, and they would stay there together in the dark, while Michael worked through songs in his head, humming fragments, stopping, adjusting, running them again. The animal didn't sleep during these sessions. He sat and watched and occasionally reached out to touch Michael's arm the way you reach out to confirm that something is still there. Those hours were, in the way Michael would later describe, the only moments that felt genuinely his, among the most productive of his career. Not because Bubbles contributed anything to the musical process in any direct way, but because the room they created together was a room without performance, and a room without performance was where the actual work happened. The work that would become bad, the work that would become the albums and the tours and the creative decisions of the next decade. It came from somewhere underneath the public version of Michael Jackson, and it needed a specific kind of quiet to surface. That quiet had a name. The name was Bubbles. Picture the image, because whether it was ever captured on film or not, it happened Michael. In a Tokyo hotel room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, with a legal pad on his knee, covered in handwritten notes, Bubbles asleep against his left thigh, Michael's hand resting on the animal's back, with the absent automaticity of someone who has forgotten they're touching something, because the contact has become as natural as breathing. Michael's eyes on the pad. His expression, the expression of someone in the middle of a thought, not performing, not aware of anything except the work. Think about what it takes to make someone completely unself-conscious. In 1983, Michael Jackson was the most photographed person on Earth. He had been performing since he was 5 years old, 19 years in front of cameras and audiences. That kind of training produces a very specific awareness, a constant low-level consciousness of being observed that most performers develop early and never fully turn off. Ambient, invisible, but always there. In that room in Tokyo, it wasn't there. By 1985, the chimpanzee had become part of the public narrative around Michael Jackson in ways that ranged from warm to reductive, depending on who was doing the narrating. The press had developed a version of the story that worked well in columns and captions. Eccentric star, strange pet, symbol of disconnection from ordinary life. That version was easy to write and easy to read, and it missed almost everything that actually mattered about what was happening. The people who wrote it were looking at the surface of a thing and describing the surface accurately while having no access to what was underneath. What was underneath was this Michael Jackson at the peak of his commercial success, had found in a 2-year-old chimpanzee from a research facility in Texas, the only relationship in his daily life that operated completely outside the apparatus of his fame. Everyone else, managers, family, collaborators, fans, journalists, even close friends, was in some relationship with Michael Jackson the phenomenon. Bubbles was in a relationship with Michael Jackson the person, because Bubbles had no mechanism for distinguishing between the two. The phenomenon was invisible to him. What was visible was the warmth of the body next to him, the familiar sound of the voice, the specific quality of attention that Michael brought to their time together, which was the same quality he'd brought to the first night in ENCINO, complete, unperforming, just present. Michael had a word for what those moments felt like. He'd been using the word since the night in the hotel room with Quincy Jones in 1978, the night he'd articulated for the first time what he actually wanted his music to do, what he actually believed it was capable of. The word was magic. He meant it the way a child means it, not as a metaphor, not as marketing language, but as a genuine description of a quality of experience that he believed was real and accessible and worth spending a life pursuing. The moments when the gap between what something was and what it should be closed completely. When the should be and the is became the same thing. When you could feel in your body that you were exactly where you were supposed to be and doing exactly what you were supposed to do. He felt it on stage. He felt it in the studio, when a track finally resolved into the shape it had been trying to find for weeks. He felt it in those early morning hours in Tokyo hotel rooms, with a legal pad and a sleeping chimpanzee and a melody working its way through his head. Magic was not complicated. Magic was what was left when you removed everything that was not magic. And by 1983, Michael's life had accumulated enough of the non-magic, enough apparatus and expectation and performance and weight, that finding a room without it required something unusual, something that didn't know what Thriller was, something that just knew he was there. Bubbles lived with Michael for 20 years. Step back from that number for a second and let it settle. 20 years. He traveled to Japan, to Europe, to Neverland when it was built. He was there through Bad and Dangerous and High Story. He was there through the years when the public narrative around Michael became something Michael himself had almost no power to shape or correct. He was there on the nights when the quiet of an empty room was the most valuable thing in the world, and the only thing not for sale. In 2003, when Bubbles had grown too large and too powerful to live safely in a domestic environment, Michael arranged for him to go to the Center for Great Apes in Wauchula, Florida. He made sure the transition was handled carefully. He made sure the facility was right. He visited when he could. The chimpanzee adjusted and thrived and is still there now, 43 years old, which is old for his species. Michael died in 2009. Bubbles is still alive. There is something in that arithmetic that resists easy interpretation. 20 years of a relationship that nobody fully understood, and most people got wrong, between a person and an animal who simply happened to find each other at the exact moment when what the person needed most was the thing the animal had most completely to offer: the ability to be present with someone without wanting anything from them, without knowing what there was to want, without the album or the moonwalk or the mythology getting in the way. Magic, Michael had said, was what he wanted the world to feel. He spent his life trying to create it for hundreds of millions of people he would never meet. But the room where he found it most reliably was a quiet one, late at night, with a legal pad and a sleeping chimpanzee, and the particular silence of someone who has finally stopped performing and started just being. That's the story nobody wrote. The story underneath the captions and the columns and the easy narrative about eccentricity. The story that was always there, if you asked the right question, which was not whether a chimpanzee made sense, but what was missing from the room when the chimpanzee arrived. If you want to hear what happened the night Michael brought Bubbles to the Grammy after-party in 1984, and what the moment that followed said about who Michael Jackson was when nobody expected him to be anything, tell me in the comments. Some rooms only open from the inside. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think.